Hey guys, so we're picking up where we left off. The last lecture I kind of ended with a, holy crap, what is that seventh hormone that the anterior pituitary gland produces? And I couldn't think of it, and I was starting to get a little worried. I was like, oh no, the teacher doesn't know the answer. But the reason why I couldn't think of it is because I missed, I messed up the slide. There's actually only 6 hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland. I believe the reading says that there's 7, and it lists endorphins as a hormone. But endorphins do help regulate mood and reduce pain. However, in general, when you are reading and learning about the anterior pituitary, the endorphins are left out. So we are looking at the 6 hormones being the follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, prolactin, and growth hormone. Okay, so I am sorry for the flustered look that I had at the end of the last lecture, but I was just confusing myself. All right, so now let's proceed to the posterior pituitary. So remember, the pituitary gland is split into 2 lobes, the anterior lobe, which is going to be towards the front of the body, and the posterior lobe, which is going to be the back. The anterior lobe also is going to be composed mostly of glandular tissue, and the anterior lobe is going to have that direct connection or control by the hypothalamus through that hypothalamic hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system, which is that blood connection that is going to allow the hypothalamus to release hormones directly into that portal system, and it's going to those hormones are going to travel directly down and affect the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to secrete some other type of hormone. All right, so now we're talking about the posterior lobe, the lobe that is in the posterior position or towards the back. So just like the pituitary gland itself has that kind of antiquated name as the hypophysis, the posterior portion of the pituitary gland sometimes is referred to as the neurohypophysis. And the reason why it's called that is because, unlike the anterior lobe, which is made up of glandular tissue, the posterior lobe is made up of neural tissue. And what we will learn is that essentially the posterior pituitary, posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is kind of just like a holding place. The lobe itself doesn't produce any endocrine hormones. What it actually does is it will hold hormones that are produced inside the hypothalamus and hold them there until that they are released. Now, because the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is made up of neural tissue, the direct connection between the posterior lobe and the hypothalamus is also going to be a neural connection. That's different than the connection of the anterior lobe to the hypothalamus, which is a circulatory portal system connection. All right, so posterior is neural, the connection to the hypothalamus is neural. And the name of the tract, and a tract is just a generalized term for any group of nerves that are running in the same direction. It is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Again, we have the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system in the anterior, and in the posterior we have the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract being a group of nerves running in a general direction. So this hypothalamic hypophyseal tract is a bundle of nerves that have the cell bodies, and that cell bodies are going to contain the nucleus of the cell, most of the organelles, most of the cytoplasm. Those cell bodies are going to be located in the hypothalamus itself. And those cell bodies are going to release hormones that are going to travel down this tract And these hormones are then going to be stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, the hormones that are produced and travel down this tract or travel down these nerves are going to be enclosed in vesicles. Remember, vesicles are small, kind of round structures. The outer covering is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. It's kind of just like a small container that we find inside of cells. So the hormones are going to be in these vesicles, and they're going to be stored in the posterior lobe. And there's a special name for the vesicles that are going to hold these hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, and they're called Herring bodies. So Herring bodies are vesicles found in the posterior pituitary gland, and they're going to contain hormones that were produced in the hypothalamus. So essentially, the hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, they're packaged in these vesicles, and then they're going to be transported down the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, and then they're going to be deposited in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland in these Herring bodies, and they'll stay there until they are released. So what are the two hormones? And if you notice, I say the posterior pituitary is going to store and secrete these two hormones, because this is much different than the anterior pituitary, because the anterior pituitary said produce and secrete. Posterior pituitary does not produce these. These are produced in the hypothalamus. So the two that are going to be stored in the Herring bodies and secreted from the posterior pituitary is going to be oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. So we talk about oxytocin first, and I talked a little bit about oxytocin when I talked about the positive feedback mechanism. I said that the oxytocin is going to be a hormone that is going to target the uterus, specifically the muscles in the uterine wall. And when oxytocin binds with these target muscle cells in the uterine wall, it's going to bring on contractions, and specifically the contractions that occur during childbirth. And another interesting thing about oxytocin is that oxytocin can also work as a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that neurons or nerve cells release so that they can communicate with adjacent nerve cells. And oxytocin is released in response to a feeling of connection to something or someone. When mothers hold their babies or feed their babies, they release a lot of oxytocin, which kind of tells them that they should be, I hate to say this, you know, because we don't ever want to think of us as humans being tricked by just chemical reactions, but essentially this oxytocin tells us, it allows us to have this feeling of bonding with a child, which increases, you know, the chances then that you are going to take care of that child, and then that child would reach maturity. Oxytocin is also released from your brain during sex, so that if you are having sex, well, whoever you have sex with, the chemicals that are released in your brain and also with your partner, in your partner's brain, is supposed to make you feel, you know, a connection or, you know, a relationship with that individual. And they've actually done studies with people and their oxytocin levels, and people who produce less oxytocin actually have a greater chance of cheating on their partner because they don't have that strong of a bonding feeling with the individual that they are with. I guess the opposite would be the same. Maybe if you produce way too much oxytocin, you become one of those, you know, psycho people that like, no, you're never going to be anyone else's, you're just mine. But I don't know. They probably haven't done a study on that, on the opposite. But that is when oxytocin is working as a neurotransmitter. In this chapter, in the context of this chapter, or this lesson, oxytocin working as a hormone is going to help trigger the contractions that are going to begin and sustain labor through childbirth. The other hormone that posterior pituitary is going to store and secrete is called the antidiuretic hormone. So you may have heard of medications or things that are diuretics. So something that is a diuretic is going to cause your kidneys to produce a lot of urine. Anything that is a diuretic is going to, a medicine that you take that is a diuretic might be called a water pill, because when you take it, it's going to cause you to pee a lot or produce a whole lot of urine because your kidneys are excreting a lot of water. So if that's what a diuretic does, an antidiuretic is going to do the opposite, right? So antidiuretic hormone, or it is often just abbreviated ADH, is going to cause the kidneys to reabsorb water. It's going to prevent water from being added to the urine, or it's going to cause the body to produce less urine because it's going to be excreting less water. So the antidiuretic hormone is going to target specific portion of the kidneys called the collecting ducts. And the collecting ducts, they do just like what their name says, they collect. What are they collecting? They're collecting water. So the antidiuretic causes these collecting ducts to basically shut off the ability to absorb water. So if they're not absorbing the water is being reabsorbed into the kidneys and eventually back into the blood. Now, one thing that we will talk about in this chapter, and we're also going to talk about a lot in the blood vessel and the heart chapter, is this concept that the more volume that we have in our blood, the higher the blood pressure is going to be. And the less volume of the blood, the lower the blood pressure is going to be. And most of that volume is going to be made up by water. So if your kidneys are reabsorbing water and preventing it from being added to the urine, your body is going to increase the volume of the blood. Increase volume of blood, increase blood pressure. If your body is going to allow for the excretion of water or the production of a lot of urine, then the amount of water in the blood is going to go down. So the volume of the blood is going to go down, and that's going to cause the blood pressure to go down. And if you have trouble kind of understanding why the volume of blood would affect the pressure, let's think about a fire hose. So a fabric fire hose. So if you were to unroll a fabric fire hose, it would be flat, okay? So if you turn on the water and we only turn it on halfway, then we have a little bit of water flowing through that hose. Well, what's going to happen is the hose is going to puff up a little bit. But, not a lot, because we just have a little volume of water going through that hose. Well, now let's say we turn on the water full blast. Well, what's going to happen? Well, that hose goes, and it kind of like pumps up very, very quickly. Because when the volume of water inside that hose increases, the pressure inside that hose increases. Same way with our blood. When we have a little bit of blood going through our vessels, they just a little bit, and there's not a lot of pressure in there. But if we increase a lot of volume inside those vessels, the vessels are going to get stretched to their max, and that's going to cause an increase in pressure inside of those vessels. So we see that this antidiuretic hormone is going to be involved in the control of blood pressure, because if antidiuretic hormone is released, then water is going to be reabsorbed, and that way it's going to be reabsorbed back into the blood, and it's going to increase blood pressure. If there is a lack of antidiuretic hormone, then our kidneys are going to excrete the water. There's going to be water removed from the blood volume is going to go down, and so will the blood pressure. And the antidiuretic hormone has this effect so much that when antidiuretic hormone is present in a large quantity, it is sometimes referred to as vasopressin. And the reason why it's called vasopressin, vaso is the Latin prefix or Latin word for a vessel, and pressin has to do with pressure. So this literally means vessel pressure. So when you have a lot of antidiuretic hormone released at once, you're going to have a lot of water retained, which means you're going to have a lot of that water re-added to the blood, and that means there's going to be a huge increase in blood pressure in the individual vessels. Interesting fact about antidiuretic hormone is that an antagonist, or something that is going to prevent the function of antidiuretic hormone, is alcohol and caffeine. So if you have, well, let's just say we all are 21 and we have indulged, let's say, in some beers. After you drink a few beers, you get, you have to go to the bathroom. You have to pee. So you go to the bathroom, and it seems like then every 5 minutes you have to go to the bathroom. Well, why is that happening? Well, because the alcohol that you're drinking is suppressing the antidiuretic hormone. And if the antidiuretic hormone is supposed to preserve water and prevent the production of urine, well, if it's being inhibited, well, now your body is going to produce a lot of urine. This is also one of the reasons why if you drink and you have a hangover the next day, you have a headache. One of the major reasons why you have that headache is because you're dehydrated. And why are you dehydrated? Well, because the alcohol kind of switched off the antidiuretic hormone, and you have essentially just urinated all of your water, a lot of the water out of your body. Caffeine does the same thing. That's why if you are dehydrated, it's not a great idea to drink a lot of caffeinated soda, because caffeine is going to yes, there's liquid in there, water in there, but that caffeine is going to cause you to go to the bathroom, or the same thing with tea. Has caffeine in there, it's going to cause you to go to the bathroom, so you're kind of defeating the purpose of drinking the fluid in the first place. All right, so those are our portions of the pituitary gland. So we're going to move to our next gland, and I'm going to take a drink of my caffeinated soda, which is going to make me go to the bathroom because it's going to inhibit my antidiuretic hormone, but I'll deal with that when it comes along. So now we're going to move to our next major endocrine gland, and that's our thyroid. Our thyroid is located right here in our neck. It's going to actually lay right below our larynx, which is our voice box. So it's right here in the neck, and I think it really kind of looks like a bow tie, because there's this kind of center that's kind of pinched in, and then there's these two lobes, or larger portions to either side. So the thyroid gland is one of the largest endocrine glands. It's found in the anterior of the neck, which means right here in the front. Anterior means the front of the body. It has two lateral lobes, and if you remember from 201, or if you didn't take 201, anything that is towards the middle or the midline of the body is referred to as being medial, middle, kind of, anything that is away from the middle or the midline is called lateral. So we have two lateral lobes that are going to be towards the sides or away from the midline of the body. So we have our left lateral lobe and our right lateral lobe. Remember, this is going to be the opposite of as you're looking at this picture, right and left, because this person is in the anatomical position facing you. So you got to remember that mirror image going on. So we have two lateral lobes, our left lateral lobe and our right lateral lobe. And the small set portion in the middle that is pinched together, that are going to hold those right and left lateral lobes together, is called the isthmus. And you may have heard of isthmus if you had studied geography. An isthmus is actually, I believe it's a term for like a connection between two islands or two larger pieces of land. The thyroid gland is going to produce, it produces and secretes two different hormones. The first one is going to be really easy to remember because it is called the thyroid hormone. It's abbreviated TH. And the second one is called calcitonin. And it might be a little bit harder to remember the name calcitonin, but it's going to be easy to remember what calcitonin does because it deals with the regulation of calcium in the bloodstream. So we're going to talk about the major hormone that the thyroid gland is going to produce, and that is the thyroid hormone. So the thyroid hormone is not going to just affect one particular organ, like the antidiuretic hormone affects the kidneys and the kidneys alone. The thyroid hormone is going to affect almost every single cell in our body. The thyroid hormone is going to help regulate metabolic rates and body temperature. So you may have heard someone say, oh, I have a thyroid problem, that's why I am, too skinny, or that's why I am too heavy. Yes, if you have a decrease in thyroid hormone production, it can affect your metabolism, but everyone who, and there's my cat. People who say that it doesn't, people sometimes use that as an excuse. There are some people that legitimately do have a thyroid problem where this can affect their overall body weight. So because the thyroid hormone is going to be able to affect every cell in the body, it's going to be able to affect the metabolism or the metabolic rate of every cell in the body. So because it regulates the metabolic rate and body temperature, people who have hyperthyroidism, and when you see hyper before as a prefix, it means too much. Okay, so I'm pretty sure you guys have heard of people who are being hyperactive. So a hyperactive person is like always moving. They have too much activity. So hyperthyroidism means that they have too much thyroid function. In this case, too much thyroid hormone is being produced. And if someone has too much thyroid hormone being produced, they're going to have an overall increase in body temperature and an overall higher metabolic rate. And the higher body temperature is actually a result of the higher metabolic rate, because when we have that conversion during cellular respiration, a little bit of that energy is going to be lost as heat energy, and collectively that causes an overall increase in body temperature. These are the people who legit have this hyperthyroidism. They can eat anything. They're constantly eating. They're not going to gain that much weight because they constantly need the nutrients and the carbohydrates to feed their cells, because their cells are just overactive. I'm not saying that everyone who is skinny has a hyperthyroidism, but if they do suffer for hyperthyroidism, this is going to be one of the caveats to it, that they are going to have to be constantly eating in order to maintain any sort of weight. On the opposite end, we have hypothyroidism. And hypothyroidism means that there is a decrease in the production or the stimulation by the thyroid hormone. And this is going to cause the opposite. It's going to cause a decrease in temperature. People who have this always feel kind of cold. And then also, and that decrease in temperature is going to be a result of a decrease in overall cellular metabolic rate. Also, what's going to happen is, because overall cellular metabolic rate in the body is decreased, it also can cause an increase in weight, because the amount of calories or food that that person is going to need to ingest in one day is going to be much lower, because the rate at which it's being used is going to be much lower because of the decrease in thyroid hormone. All right, not only does thyroid hormone help regulate metabolic rate and body temperature, but it is also going to stimulate growth rate and function. And this thyroid hormone is going to work in conjunction with growth hormone to increase growth and development of people as they mature, children as they mature to adults. Another thing that thyroid hormone does is that it's very, very important in the development of the fetal brain. So in utero, the fetal brain is going to be affected by the thyroid hormone levels of the mother. And the thyroid hormone levels of the mother are going to allow for the new nerve cells that are being formed to the technical term is called neural migration. It's going to cause those individual brain cells to actually move to areas in the newly forming brain, move to the correct areas. And you might, well, what happens if the neurons don't move or the nerve cells don't move to the correct areas? Well, there was a research study that our lab was involved in that showed that people who have schizophrenia have different cell concentrations in a certain layer of their brain. So why would that happen? Well, it has to do with something that occurred during the brain development during neuron migration. Something prevented certain neurons from moving to the specific area in the brain that they needed to move to. So perhaps during pregnancy, if a woman, I'm not saying this, we did not get this far in the study. We just said that yes, there was a difference in the number of cells and particular areas between normal brains, quote unquote normal brains, and also the brains versus the brains of people who had schizophrenia. So if the concentration of nerve cells in a normal brain was higher than those in a schizophrenic brain, specifically in just certain layers, perhaps the mother at a certain time did not have adequate thyroid hormone levels, or perhaps there was something blocking that thyroid hormone level from affecting the fetal brain development. Not sure, but that could possibly be one of the reasons why. Next, there we go. Next, can we do this? There we go. All right, so if we go back here, we can look at this whole entire trail of events occurred. One thing that we talked about thyroid hormone when we talked about the negative feedback system. So how is the thyroid gland going to be stimulated to release those thyroid hormones? Well, we're going to start off here in the hypothalamus. That hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called thyrotropin releasing hormone. It enters into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. It's going to bind to target cells in the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to cause those target cells to release thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. That thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be picked up by the systemic circulation, and it's going to bind to target cells in the thyroid gland. When it binds to those target cells in the thyroid gland, it's going to cause those cells to release thyroid hormone. And the thyroid hormone that is going to travel in the systemic circulation, and it's going to bring about increased metabolism, and it also could bring about growth and development. This increased catecholamine effect we'll talk about a little bit, but right now I just want to focus mostly on this increased metabolism and the growth and development. One thing before we go to the next slide, I want to mention that thyroid hormones are going to exist in two different forms. There is a form called T3, and there's a form called T4, and I'm going to explain to you which each of these are. So the two forms are T3 and T4. So the technical name for T3 is triiodothyronine. You get the 3 from the tri part, and it has iodothyronine because it also is made up of iodine and tyrosine. So the reason why it's called T3 is because it has 3 iodines on it. And if we compare T3 to T4, we see that T3 is 3 to 5 times more active than the T4 version. So in circulation, we have both T3 and T4. T3 is going to be 3 to 5 times more likely to bind to a receptor and bring about a change in a particular cell. The other form that thyroid hormone can circulate in is T4, and it's called thyroxine. It has a 4 in there because there's 4 iodine residues in there. And T4 is considered to be a pro-hormone. And the reason why it's called a pro-hormone is because in circulation, the T4 version of the thyroid hormone kind of circulates inactively. But at a certain time, T4 can easily be converted into T3 by just breaking off one of those, hello Charlie, one of those iodine residues. And when that happens, T4 is converted to T3, and T3 is going to be that active form of thyroid hormone. So where T4 can be converted to T3 are in 3 specific peripheral organs: the liver, the kidneys, and the spleen. And the way that this is going to happen is that there's a specific enzyme called iodothyronine deiodinase. So that name is very long. If you ever see a chemical and it ends in ASE, it's probably an enzyme of some sort. So iodothyronine deiodinase. Well, if you de-ice something, you remove the ice. If you de-ionize something, you're removing an iodine. So here we have 4 iodines, and here we have 3 iodines. So if we de-ionize the T4, well, now we have a T3, and that's exactly what this enzyme does. It's located in, it's found in the liver, kidneys, and spleen. It's going to remove one of those iodines from T4, converting it into T3. So essentially, T4 can act as a extra reservoir of T3 in the blood, because T4 can circulate and be in constant circulation, but not necessarily have any kind of effect on a target cell, because it's kind of in that inactive state. But if thyroid hormone is needed, that T4 can, bam, immediately be converted into T3, and we don't have to wait for the thyroid gland to actually ramp up production of thyroid hormone in the form of T3. So that T4 can act as a reservoir that's just there for any moment in time. It can be converted to T3, and we can have an immediate activation of target cells. All right, so let's talk about how these thyroid hormones are produced, because thyroid hormone is a little bit different than the other hormones in the body, because it's going to be a secretion by an endocrine cell, but it also needs to combine with something that we will ingest or get from our diets, and that is going to be iodine. That's why it was triiodine thyroxine or thyroidine, because we need those iodines. All right, so let's start from the beginning of how this is going to form. So the thyroid gland has been stimulated by the target cells being attached by the thyroid stimulating hormone. So if we look at the thyroid gland, which you will in the lab, there are these cells that form these hollow ball-like structures. And the cells that are going to form these hollow spheres, kind of like ping pong ball spheres, are called follicular cells. So if you're using this to, and if we're thinking about a ping pong ball, the white plastic part would be composed of these individual follicular cells. So these follicular cells are going to be responsible for producing a protein called thyroglobulin. And as they produce the thyroglobulin, they're going to dump that thyroglobulin into the hollow center. So if this is our ping pong ball, these would be our follicular cells. They would produce the thyroglobulin and then dump it to the inside of the hollow ping pong ball. And that open hollow part in the middle is called the follicular lumen. So if we look at this picture here, this is one of those follicles, those round balls, kind of cut in half so that we see the open interior, and then the exterior that's made up of those follicular cells. So if we look at one of these tiny follicular cells here, we blow it up to this would be the outside of the follicle. This would be the individual cells that make up the follicle or the follicular cells, and then this would be the opening in the middle, the follicular lumen. So inside these follicular cells, we're going to see that thyroid globulin is going to be produced. And that thyroid globulin is going to then be exocytosed or secreted into the follicular lumen. Now, that's the first component we need for thyroid hormone. The second component we need is iodine, and our body doesn't make iodine. Our body is going to have to get iodine from our diet. So here we have a happy little blood vessel that is located near this follicle, and inside that blood, because of our diet, if we're eating a proper diet, there's going to be iodine. And so the iodine is going to move out of the blood into the follicular cell, and then it's going to be moved into the follicular lumen. So now in the lumen, we have the thyroid globulin, which was secreted by the follicular cell itself. And we also have iodine, and that iodine got in there because it moved out of the blood through the cell into the lumen. All right, so thyroid globulin and iodine. So now we need to pair these two up. And there is an enzyme inside the follicular lumen called thyroperoxidase. Again, ASE, that should be a hint that it's going to be an enzyme. So thyroperoxidase is often abbreviated TPO, because who the hell wants to write that out every time or even say it? So this enzyme is going to bind that iodine that was taken out of the blood, moved through the cell, and pushed into the lumen, with the thyroid globulin, which was produced in the cell and pushed into the lumen. And depending on how many iodines are joined to the thyroid globulin, we're going to produce monoiodotyrosine, where one iodine is added, or diiodotyrosine, where we're going to have two iodines that are going to be added. All right, so quick review right now. Follicular cells, thyroid globulin made in the follicular cells, pushed into the lumen. Iodine taken out of the blood, moved through the cell, pushed into the lumen. Iodine and thyroid globulin in the lumen. The enzyme TPO comes along. If it adds two iodines to the thyroid globulin, we have diiodotyrosine, DIT. If it adds just one iodine to the thyroid globulin, we have MIT, or monoiodotyrosine. The next thing that's going to happen is that a proteases, and proteases, a protease, ASE, again, enzyme, a protease is just a general term for some sort of enzyme that digests protein. So a protease is going to start digesting or it's going to digest the MIT or the DIT. And what is going to be produced is either T3 or T4. The T3 and the T4 are then going to be released from the follicle lumen. They're actually going to move back through the follicular cell and into the blood. And when they move in there, they're going to circulate as either T3 or T4. Again, T3 is going to be the active form. T4 is going to be the prohormone or the inactive reservoir. And T3 is going to be able to attach to the target cells, and it's going to be able to activate them. T4 can be converted into T3 in the liver, the spleen, or the kidneys. And once T4 is converted into T3, then T3, in that form, it can activate cells. All right, so quick review. We have our thyroid follicle. It's a round structure. Outside is made up of those follicular cells. Inside, the hollow opening is called the follicular lumen. So the follicle cells are going to produce a secretion, a protein secretion called thyroid globulin, that's going to be pushed into the follicular lumen. Blood is going to carry iodine near the follicles. It's going to be taken up through the follicular cell and then pushed into the follicular lumen. Then an enzyme, PTO, is going to cause the iodine and the thyroglobulin to be joined together. If one iodine is added to the thyroglobulin, it's called MIT. If two iodines are added to the thyroglobulin, it's going to be called DIT. Both MIT and DIT are going to then be brought into the cell, and there's going to be a protease or a protein digesting enzyme that's going to go to work on that on the MIT or the DIT, and it's going to convert it into either T3 or T4. Once it has been converted into T3 or T4, it's then going to be dumped into the circulation, where T3 is going to be the active form of thyroid hormone, and T4 is going to be circulating as what is referred to as a prohormone or a reservoir. Now, I said when our bodies make the thyroid hormone, we're going to be able, our bodies themselves are going to make the thyroglobulin portion, but we don't make iodine. Iodine is an element, a pure element, and we need to ingest that. So what happens if you don't have enough iodine in your diet? Well, if you don't have enough iodine in your diet, what's going to happen is you're going to develop this large kind of growth on your neck region, and it's called a goiter. So this is an individual that has a goiter, and you can obviously see that their neck is very much swollen. This is actually where their larynx is. So what is actually swollen is the lateral lobes of the thyroid gland. So you can see that this left lateral lobe is huge. I mean, the right one is large also, but the left one is huge. And you get goiters because of a deficiency in iodine in your diet. Now, why would this happen? Well, thyroglobulin is going to be produced by the follicular cells, and it's going to be dumped into the center of the lumen, And essentially, thyroglobulin becomes trapped inside that lumen because it's not going to be able to leave unless it is attached to an iodine. So if iodine is deficient in the diet, then essentially thyroglobulin gets stuck inside that lumen. And our body's not going to stop producing this thyroglobulin, especially if it needs thyroid hormone, because it says, oh crap, we don't have any thyroid hormone. Send a message to the thyroid gland to produce more thyroid hormone. And so then the thyroid gland says, okay, well, I guess I need to produce more thyroglobulin. So it starts producing more thyroglobulin. But that never gets out of the thyroid gland. It never gets out of that follicular lumen. It gets stuck in there because there's no iodine to attach to it to release it out. So essentially what happens is that follicular lumen starts to swell and swell and swell and swell and swell and get larger and larger and larger and larger because it's just jam-packed full of this thyroglobulin that's trapped in the follicular lumen. Now, goiters are very common in third world countries places that proper nutrition, unfortunately, is not ready available to the masses. Now, in the United States, this used to be a huge problem. I mean, there's a lot of people in the United States nowadays, especially nowadays, that do not, unfortunately, have proper nutrition or access to proper or nutritional food. But one thing that the U.S. did is that we added iodine to something that Americans eat way too much of, and that is salt. So if you look at your salt, just straight up regular salt, I'm not talking about like kosher salt or Himalayan salt or anything that's like, quote unquote fancy salts. If you look at your straight up old school, Morton salt in the paper kind of like container, it says iodinized salt. So by adding iodine to salt, which, like I said, most Americans get way too much salt in their diets in the first place, it ensured that Americans would get enough iodine in their diets, And when they did so, the occurrence of goiters decreased dramatically. So you can thank your thyroid gland for iodized salt. All right, control of the thyroid hormone release. Let me move this over here. There we go. Move me over here. Okay. So we've talked about this several times, and we talked about the negative feedback mechanism. I just talked about it a few minutes ago when we were first going over the thyroid hormone, but let's give it another look over. All right, so here we have our thyroid hormone release, and we have this classic hypothalamus, pituitary, another endocrine gland stimulation. So to start this off, what's going to start this cascade of events occurring is that the hypothalamus is going to be triggered when thyroid hormone levels drop in the blood. So when thyroid levels drop in the blood, the hypothalamus is going to start to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. This thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, is going to enter into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, and it's going to travel to the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to attach to target cells, and it's going to trigger those target cells to produce TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone is then going to be released into systemic circulation, and it's going to attach to target cells on the thyroid gland. And that's going to stimulate those target cells in the thyroid gland to start producing thyroglobulin, which is going to then be added to, or iodine is going to be added to that whole process we just talked about to produce T3 and T4. The T3 and T4 are then going to be released into the systemic circulation, where it's going to travel throughout the entire body and is going to bring about change. Now, when the thyroid gland produces enough thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, that the thyroid hormone levels in the blood start to rise, well, that rise in hormone levels in the blood is going to essentially go back and shut off the thyroid stimulating hormone production in the pituitary gland. And it's also going to shut off the thyrotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus. So it's a negative feedback system, because the production of the final product is going to be in control of actually shutting its own production off. This also brings up, again, that interesting problem that endocrinologists can run into when they are looking at hormone levels. So say, for instance, someone comes in and they have all the signs of hypothyroidism, or not enough thyroid gland being produced. So they have, a lower body temperature, a lower metabolic rate, maybe they put on some weight very quickly over a short period of time. Well, okay, so they're not producing enough thyroid hormone. Their thyroid hormone levels are very low. Well, are their thyroid hormone levels low because there's something wrong with the thyroid gland itself and it's not producing enough thyroid hormone? Are the thyroid hormone levels low because there's something wrong with the pituitary gland and it's not producing thyroid stimulating hormone, so the thyroid gland is not being stimulated? Or is there a problem with the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus isn't producing enough thyrotropin releasing hormone so that the pituitary gland isn't stimulated, so that the thyroid gland isn't stimulated? So you have to look at all of these levels to get to actually the root of the problem, which one is, causing this, decrease in thyroid hormone production. All right, so the other hormone that the thyroid gland produces is calcitonin. Now, calcitonin is produced by another type of cells. So the follicular cells, I said, make up those golf, those ping pong ball kind of shaped follicles with the open center. Well, the follicular cells make up about 99.9% of the cells that make up that exterior of that follicle. 0.1% of the cells that make up that structure are called parafollicular cells. Now, parafollicular cells are not going to produce thyroglobulin. The parafollicular cells are going to produce this other hormone called calcitonin. And calcitonin is going to target two different types of cells and an organ inside of the body. The two cells that they are going to, calcitonin is going to target is osteoclasts and osteoblasts. Now, if you took 201, we talked about osteoclasts and we talked about osteoblasts. These are bone cells. So what gives it away that they belong to the bone is this beginning portion, or this first part of the word, the osteo portion of this word. Anything that is osteo means bone. Think of, you may have heard of osteoarthritis. Well, that's bone arthritis that has affected the bone. So both osteoclasts and osteoblasts are going to be cells that we're going to find in the bone. Now, the only difference between these two words, as you can see, is this little letter right here. So osteoclast has a C in it, and osteoblast has a B in it. So one of these cells is going to help build up the bone. It's going to make more, matrix, or more, it's going to increase the mass, shall we say, of a bone. And one of them is going to kind of digest or break down or make the mass of the bone less. So the way that you can remember this is that osteoclasts are going to cut away at the bone. C is for cut. And osteoblasts are going to build up the bone or make them, increase the mass. So calcitonin is going to inhibit osteoclasts. So if osteoclasts break down the bone, then if you inhibit it, that means that there's not going to be a breakdown of bone. Okay? So if it does this, essentially it is going to reduce the amount of bones that are being reduce the amount of bone tissue that's being broken down. And we all know that bones are made up of what? Well, they're made up of a lot of minerals, but one of the main minerals they're made up of is calcium. So if osteoclasts cut away at the bone, as they're cutting it away and digesting it, that calcium that they're breaking down is being released into the blood. So if we inhibit them and they don't break down the bone, then we're going to prevent calcium from being released into the blood. Therefore, we're going to reduce calcium levels. Okay. Osteoblasts are going to build up the bone. So they stimulate production of new bone tissue. So calcitonin is going to stimulate osteoblasts. Well, what do osteoblasts need in order to build up new bone? Well, they're going to need to take calcium from the bloodstream so that they can incorporate it into the new bone tissue. So if they stimulate the buildup of new bone, they're going to stimulate or increase the amount of calcium that these osteoblasts are going to need to take from the bloodstream. Again, reducing blood calcium levels. The last thing that calcitonin is going to do is it's going to affect the kidneys, and it affects the kidneys to inhibit reabsorption of calcium. So one of the things that can be removed from the blood as the blood is filtered in the kidneys is calcium. So some of that calcium is going to be reabsorbed, put back into the bloodstream, but some of it's not. And the kidneys, when they are targeted by calcitonin, are going to be inhibited to reabsorb calcium. So more calcium is going to be put into the urine. Now, calcitonin is going to work together with another hormone, which is its antagonist, which is called the parathyroid hormone that we're going to talk about in just a minute. And the parathyroid hormone, together working with the calcitonin, is going to help maintain blood calcium levels within a very narrow range. Calcitonin is going to cause blood calcium levels to be lowered, and parathyroid hormone is going to cause blood calcium to be raised. So if we have a drop in blood calcium levels, we're going to release parathyroid hormones to bring it and to raise it. If we have too high of a blood calcium levels, we're going to release calcitonin so that those blood levels, calcium levels, can be lowered. And together, these two are going to work together to keep our blood calcium levels within that very small range of homeostasis. And the reason why this is important is because calcium in the blood is going to be essential for the proper functioning of our nervous system and our muscular systems. If we have too low calcium levels in our blood, our nervous systems are going to shut down and not work properly. Our muscles are not going to be able to contract. Big problem. That's going to cause death pretty quickly, because if your muscles can't contract properly, well, you're not going to be able to breathe because your muscles enable you to inhale and exhale. If you have too high of calcium levels in your blood, your nervous system can be overstimulated, your muscles can be overstimulated. Not good, you're going to die, because your muscles are going to become enter in tetany, and they're going to be in this constant contractive motion, and your nervous system can cause seizures and it cause death. So you may not really think that calcium is that important, or calcium levels in your blood, it's just calcium. It's immensely important. Too much, you're going to die. Too little, you're going to die. So these two hormones are very important for keeping it within that normal range so that our muscles are going to be able to contract regularly, and our nervous system is going to be able to communicate regularly. All right, to finish this lecture up, we're going to talk really quickly about the parathyroid glands. Now, the parathyroid glands are located on the posterior portion of the thyroid gland. So here we have this person who is standing sideways. So this is one of the lateral lobes. Let's say this would be, if I was standing this way, this would be the left lateral lobe. Here would be the isthmus. So this is the anterior portion, and back here would be the posterior portion. This right here is the esophagus, where our food goes down, and the trachea right here, over which the thyroid gland lays. Well, on the posterior portion of the thyroid glands, there are these little tiny groupings of cells. And these little tiny groupings of cells are called the parathyroid glands. And people have at least 4, some people have more, but on average, people have 4 of these little groupings of cells that are called the parathyroid glands collectively. Each one is quite small. It's about the size of a grain of rice, so this is actually quite enlarged on this image. And as I said, they're located on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, and the parathyroid glands are going to be responsible for producing the parathyroid hormone. Now, I just talked about the calcitonin and how the calcitonin is going to reduce blood calcium levels. Well, the parathyroid is going to raise blood calcium levels, and it's going to do so by stimulating or inhibiting the same 3 things that calcitonin did, but it's going to do this in the opposite. So it's going to stimulate the osteoclast. Remember, osteoclasts are going to cut down bone. It's going to cut down the bone tissue. So if it stimulates these osteoclasts, the osteoclasts start digesting bone, digesting bone, digesting bone. And as they're digesting the bone, what are they doing? Well, they are releasing calcium. This calcium enters the bloodstream, blood calcium levels rise. oh, I don't have the osteoblast on here, but it would also act to inhibit osteoblasts. Osteoblasts build up the bone, B. So it's going to stop building up the bone because these osteoblasts are going to have to take calcium out of the blood in order to build bone up. Parathyroid hormone is going to affect the GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract. Now, in order for our body to absorb calcium from our diet, we need to have vitamin D. And our body makes vitamin D. Our skin actually does. When our skin is exposed to UV light, it is going to make vitamin D. Without vitamin D, our bodies cannot absorb calcium properly. So the parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate the GI tract to increase the activation of vitamin D that our body has produced. If you ever noticed, if you drink milk, it's vitamin D fortified, or if you drink orange juice that has calcium in it, it also says it has vitamin D added. Why? Well, because you can eat or even drink as much calcium as you want, but without this vitamin D, you're just gonna pass that calcium right out of your body. So by increasing the activation of vitamin D, it's going to increase the absorption of calcium, or any calcium that we happen to ingest. Kidneys going to do the opposite of calcitonin. Calcitonin promoted the kidneys to excrete calcium, to get it out of the body, to put it into the urine. Therefore, if it's put into the urine, it's not in the blood, levels are going to drop. Parathyroid hormone is going to do the opposite. It's going to promote kidneys to reabsorb that calcium. And when it reabsorbs that calcium, it's going to put it into the blood, causing blood calcium levels to rise. How is parathyroid going to be triggered? Well, when blood calcium levels drop, parathyroid hormone is going to be triggered so that those levels can be brought up. Just like when blood calcium levels get too high, calcitonin is going to be triggered so that calcitonin can, why do I keep saying calcitonin? I don't know. Calcitonin can lower those blood calcium levels to a regular level. We are stopped here. And I gotta go down here. I love this laser pointer, but it makes the control this a little bit odd.